You have heard it, maybe even debate it. Africans had slaves too, so Europeans were not the only ones. Slavery exists everywhere, so why blame white people? The point of this argument is usually to water down the brutality of the transatlantic slave trade. Make it seem like it was just business as usual. But here is the truth.
I'm not gonna lie to you. It's hard to be surprised by how absurdly evil the US operates if you have like a real functioning knowledge of chattel slavery. And this is not a dig. Like, people are actively barred from better education and the totality of the horrors of chattel slavery because it allows them to like obfuscate how uniquely evil it was. This is one of the reasons why white separatists and Christian nationalists and conservatives love to bring up like, oh, there was already a slave trade. Africans were selling Africans. Arabs were selling Africans. Like, yes, there was an Arabic slave trade. There was an African slave trade, but they were not the same as the US's. They know that, which is why they're nostalgic for the time. A lot of people don't realize one of the reasons why race relations in the US isn't muddied the way that it is in Europe or in other colonies that they had is because we had no pathway to personhood. That was a unique quality of American slavery. Every other place had a path to citizenship or personhood. You can buy your way into freedom. You could breed your way into freedom. That's how we get like the mulatto. This was big in Spanish and Portuguese colonies. If you bred out enough African, you would be freed. If you married out, like in Brazil or in Portuguese colonies, you would be freed. No such thing existed here. It was the one drop rule. That matters. It's one of the reasons why historically, I don't see why we use like BIPOC language, because it's not about everybody else. And this isn't like in a good way, but it's the reality. Like, the US is very much still reconciling with a black-white racial conflict. The rest of y'all are collateral. That sounds mean, but it's the truth. And history shows us that, because even amongst its other enslaving white counterparts, the US was still amongst their contemporaries regarded as a uniquely evil form of enslaver with very stringent race relations. And all of it is contemporary. We are living in derivatives and replications of the plantation every day. And I'm thinking about it a lot because seeing these people be like extrajudiciously deported, whether or not they're citizens, whether or not they're here illegally, borders aren't real. I don't care about them, but you get what I mean. This like no tolerance policy of the other is like really fascinating if you know like how much work it took to maintain the power of whiteness. The fact that post enslavement, after the Reconstruction period, they had to restructure what whiteness was because of their numbers. And it's the racial anxieties accompanied by white folks' fear of black retaliation that led to them subsuming other groups that were not considered white into their own as a self-preservation tactic. This is where we see them giving the Irish and the Italians and the Jewish people a chance to like audition into whiteness to bulk their numbers. And this is something they've been thinking about for a long time. It's why the Great Replacement theory is literally the bedrock of conservatism. This is just a contemporary version of white enslavers being absurdly cruel and then writing in their diaries about how they fear about being killed by their like slaves at night. This is just that with Google. But one of the other reasons why they make sure that people don't know the full scope of chattel slavery in the American context is to see like where it was failed otherwise when people would try to replicate it elsewhere. After the Civil War, tens of thousands of white enslavers took their plantations, uprooted them, and placed them in Brazil because, not so fun fact, I guess, Brazil was the last in the West to abolish slavery. They didn't get rid of it until 1888. They were also the colony with the most enslaved Africans total. This is why the largest black population outside of the continent of Africa is Brazil. When these white enslavers got there, again, fleeing having to get rid of their plantations, they wrote endlessly about how homesick they were, not just because of things like the climate and the fact that they weren't allowed to fully replicate the same plantations. Like, for instance, a lot of them wanted to grow cotton. You can't do that in a subtropical climate like Brazil. But explicitly, their biggest gripe with Brazil was with its race relations, because they had a freed black population. Because Brazil, a Portuguese colony, was one where you could breed out blackness, you could buy out of enslavement. There was a path to citizenship. They were considered people there, and that was something white enslavers physically couldn't conceive of. It's quite literally what led to tens of thousands of them coming back to the States. A few successfully settled there. That's why you get the town of Americana in Brazil. That's how you get this like ethnic group considered the Confederados, which are the descendants of these previously enslavers who then started to mix with the local, Brazilian population over time. And one of the reasons why the Confederados and Americana settlement is at the top of my mind is that when these tens of thousands of homesick, like middle class, they weren't like the most wealthy, but semi-wealthy white enslavers were done with their like Brazilian project, they petitioned the US to help subsidize their travel back because they spent all their money trying to replicate their plantations in Brazil. And the US did! Like, the US literally helped pay to repatriate these enslavers back to the States, specifically back to the South. And it's this knowledge that blows my mind all the time, where it's like my tax dollars, your tax dollars are being used to send people wherever the fuck this administration wants them to go. And this is the same country that was like paying out reparations to white enslavers for loss of product and income. The same country that, when after a civil war had tens of thousands of defectors leave to maintain slavery, they helped pay to bring back. That's this country's legacy. That's why I always say the US is profoundly unique in its evil. Our race relations are very clear. This is not like a brown, black, like melting pot struggle. This is all about reminding Black people our ultimate place, which is as being a proprietary force for white America. And everyone else is essentially just collateral. You have to get everyone else out because they are amongst us. But also, if there are less of the brown, less groups in between us, it'll be much easier to legislate and navigate a white-black racial caste system, which is why they are deeply nostalgic for the American past, because uniquely speaking, within the context of transatlantic slavery, we were the ones with the harshest, most violent race politic. And that's what they are seeking again. Race relations is the very reason why our left politics is considered the right in Europe. This country is soulless for a reason. And this isn't to say that Europe didn't have its problems. Again, they are the reason we had these colonies. They're a reason that many people speak Spanish, that a quarter of the world is francophone, why folks who should have never heard about a pope have Catholic names. But ultimately, this is just the pot of racial violence and terror boiling over finally post-Civil War. Because it's not enough that they didn't punish the South. They were actively rewarding them, giving them positions of power and telling them to just replicate what they needed quietly. And that's what happened. And we're living in the after of that. And I think if more people had a better education about the totality of chattel slavery in the American context, they would be less occupied with preserving the perceived soul of the country and more interested in, after this shit burns down, what can we build that's better? I've been begging y'all to get woke on transatlantic slavery for so long, and Reconstruction specifically for so long, for this purpose. Because the Black folks who were allowed to have this education, we knew time was a ticking, and the time is now.
There have always been Black Americans willing to fight and die for a country that enslaved, abused, and exploited them, and often didn't even see them as full human beings. They thought that by fighting for their country, they could earn the equality promised in America's founding documents and preached by its founding fathers. In fact, one of the first people to give their life to the American Revolution was a Black man named Crispus Attucks. Attucks is a fascinating figure in American history, and his name shows his unique origins. Both of his parents were enslaved. His father was Black, his mother was Native American, and his name reflects these origins. The name Crispus was given to him by his slave owner, and like many names that enslavers chose, it comes from Roman history. Crispus was the name of one of the sons of the Roman Emperor Constantine. Attucks is derived from an indigenous word for deer. In 1750, Attucks escaped from slavery, and in 1770, he was living in Boston as a dock worker using the name Michael Johnson to avoid being discovered and captured. During this time, Boston was being occupied by 2,000 British soldiers, who were there to enforce the unpopular Stamp Act and control the rebellious American colonist. On March 5th, 1770, a group of colonists began harassing a British soldier and pelting him with rocks and snowballs. When he called for reinforcements, one of the soldiers opened fire, causing the rest to start shooting into the crowd. The soldiers ended up killing 5 colonists, with the first being Crispus Attucks. This came to be known as the Boston Massacre, and it played a key role in turning American sentiment against the British Empire and fueling the flames of revolution. The irony is that the first casualty of the American Revolution was an escaped slave, and once the colonists won their independence from Britain, they would create a country that continued slavery and continued to deny Black Americans their fundamental human rights. Sometimes the Civil War is referred to as the Second American Revolution, and just like with the first, Black Americans were on the front lines. In 1861, abolitionist George Stearns formed the Emancipation League to persuade President Lincoln that freeing the slaves had to be the primary goal of the Civil War. Stearns wrote a letter to Lincoln arguing that Black soldiers were needed to ensure a Union victory, and Lincoln agreed. So in 1862, Stearns traveled all over the North and organized 10 Black regiments, including the famous 54th Massachusetts Regiment. You might be familiar with their story from the iconic 1989 film Glory, starring Morgan Freeman and Denzel Washington. In 1863, the abolitionist governor of Massachusetts, John Andrew, appointed Robert Shaw to train and lead the all-Black regiment. The Black abolitionist Frederick Douglass was one of the biggest recruiters of the 54th Regiment, and his 2 sons were among the first volunteers. Like other abolitionists, Douglass believed that it was critical to have Black soldiers on the front lines in the war to end slavery. In 1863, Douglass said, I know the colored men of the North. I know the colored men of the South. They are ready to rally under the stars and stripes at the first tap of the drum. Give them a chance. Stop calling them the N-word and call them soldiers. The 54th Regiment fought bravely at the Second Battle of Fort Wagner in South Carolina. Even though the unit was mostly destroyed and several of the black soldiers lost their lives, they helped to inspire more than 180,000 black Americans to fight for the Union, which Lincoln later admitted was critical to winning the war. Even though black soldiers fought for America over and over again, they were still treated with disrespect and open racism all the way into the 20th century. This was definitely the experience of a heroic group of black soldiers called the Harlem Hellfighters, who fought for their country during World War I. The Hellfighters started out as an all-black unit of National Guardsmen from Harlem, and during World War I they were sent to Europe to serve on the Western Front. However, the U.S. military would not let them fight alongside white soldiers, and they were only allowed to do manual labor. Eventually, the U.S. Army decided to give these black soldiers to the French. But before they did, they sent the French army a secret bulletin about how to treat them. The message said, "Although a citizen of the United States, the black man is regarded by the white American as an inferior being with whom relations of business or service are only possible. We must not eat with them, must not shake hands with them, or meet to talk with them outside of the requirements of military service." Even though the U.S. Army wanted the French to treat black soldiers as inferior, the French decided to put them on the front lines and let them fight. This is when those soldiers earned the name the Harlem Hellfighters, because of their bravery and courage. One of the most legendary figures from this unit was Henry Johnson, who fought and killed several German soldiers in hand-to-hand combat. The French awarded the Hellfighters with several medals for their service, but the U.S. government gave them nothing and refused to recognize their achievements and sacrifice. It wasn't until 2015 when Obama finally awarded Henry Johnson the Medal of Honor, even though Johnson had died 86 years earlier in 1929. The Harlem Hellfighters and other black soldiers risked their lives for their country to show that they deserved equal rights. When they got home, they felt like their service entitled them to live a life free of racism and discrimination. However, they received the exact opposite. Instead of coming home to a country that welcomed them and celebrated their service, they encountered one of the most violent periods of American racism, known as the Red Summer of 1919. All across the country, white people attacked and murdered black Americans for simply wanting their American dream. Black Americans were attacked for simply wanting a good-paying job or a neighborhood to live in where they felt safe. Instead of honoring black soldiers for their heroism, they became the prime target for violent racists. Black veterans were murdered with impunity because the mantra of the country was that black life did not matter. The U.S. military wasn't desegregated until 1948, which was only 77 years ago. And even though the country has made great progress since then, that progress is currently in danger of being erased and reversed. Recently, we've seen the Trump administration attacking any signs of diversity, equity, and inclusion in American life and in American history. Most disturbing is how U.S. government institutions have been purging their websites of any mention of black Americans or their service to this country. And now Trump has called for the Smithsonian and other museums to get rid of this history too. What we're witnessing is a full-on attack on American history and an attempt to whitewash our past and make it seem like black Americans played no part in making this country great. But the truth is, black Americans are the only ones who have ever made this country great. Even though they've been enslaved, abused, and discriminated against for centuries, they've never stopped fighting for their freedom and dignity. They've never stopped fighting for this country to live up to its grand ideals and promises of equality. This isn't DEI, and it isn't black history. This is American history, and it's the only history of this country that we can be proud of.
My name is Mario, and I'm tired of the bullshit. I don't think that there's any group of people in this country that knows what's at stake more than black people. I'm going to repeat that. I don't think that any group of people in this country knows more of what is at stake than black people. So when white people and other groups of people tell black people that we need to be hitting the streets too, lest something bad happen to us, you missed the point. Something bad has already happened to us. Something bad has been happening to us. That's the reason why we've been hitting the streets for these past 10 or so years in the first place. I wonder how many white folks, how many Asians, how many other groups of people had to have the talk, if you know what I mean, with their children, especially their sons, about how to stay alive during a police stop. I wonder if you ever done that. Wonder how many white voters have been purged off of the voter rolls during the last 25 years. Black unemployment is always higher than white unemployment, and don't give me that they're lazy shit. Black income dwarfs that of white income. White women make more than black men, and black women, who are perhaps the most educated per capita of any other group, make less than black men. We know that if anything bad happens in this country, we're the first ones to feel it. Are the proverbial canaries in the coal mine. The problem isn't the fact that we decided to sit this out. There's reasons for that. The problem is you keep choosing whiteness and racism and xenophobia over what is good for all of us. Perceived silence is a protest within itself. That you can be trusted, and we'll march together again. If not,
this is all I got from this video.
Yes, it is true. Form of servitude existed in Africa before European colonization. But here is what this defenders never mentioned. African slavery was not race-based. It was not built on the idea that one group of people was less than human because of their skin color. It was not generational and industrialized. In many African societies, slaves could marry, own land, earn their freedom, and even rise to high social status. It was not built to destroy identity. African system of servitude did not rape people from their culture, erase their names, ban their languages, or force them into centuries of trauma and systemic oppression. Now, compare that to transatlantic channel slavery, where Africans were kidnapped, dehumanized, sold like cattle, and treated as property for life and for generations to come. This argument is not really about history. It is about avoidance. It is about avoiding accountability and avoiding guilt and avoiding having to deal with the legacy of white supremacy. By saying Africans did it too, they try to erase centuries of radicalized brutality, economic exploitation, colonization, and the ripple effect we are still living with today. This kind of logic is dangerous. It tries to rewrite history to comfort the descendants of oppressors while dismissing the lived experiences and generational trauma of the descendants of the oppressed. It says, we do not need to talk about reparations. We do not need to teach accurate history. We are all equally guilty, so let's just move on. But silence does not heal. Lies do not liberate. Truth does. Instead of deflating with half-truths, here's the real convo. What system today were built on slavery and colonialism? Why is black history still optional in schools? What does justice look like in a world built on stolen labor and stolen lives? What do you think? Why do you think this argument keeps coming up? Let's talk about it in the comments. Like, share, and subscribe. Until next time, cheers and have a good one.